Hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here. So today we have Professor Steve Schick, and so I'm super excited that you're here with us. And do you want to just quickly do an introduction of yourself?
Sure, I'm happy to. Well, first of all, thanks very much for inviting me. This is really great that you're doing this. And when you, Victoria, when you reached out to me, I was so pleased that you thought of me. So thank you very much. And I'll tell you, I just to make a good impression, I shaved just before I came to the meeting, and I managed to cut myself. So I think it's under control now. But if you see me like doing this, then it's a razor accident that was. Well, actually, I would like to say it's beyond my control, but it was totally in my control. I just, it was operator error. So in any event, that's just a little bit of an explanation, but I hope you'll understand that the fact that I wanted to shave for you was a sign of my respect for the moment and my commitment to talking to you. So,
We're honored.
well, great. So you got the shaved, slightly bleeding version of me. Anyway, I'm happy to introduce myself. I know almost everybody, I think, and and happy to see you. And I've been at UCSD. So first of all, main thing is I hope you'll call me Steve, not just on the call, but whenever. That's how I like to think of myself, as I'm involved in the UCSD music department. And I realize that I am now almost exactly at the 30-year mark of teaching at UCSD. I came on January 1st, 1991, which now starts to add up. And before that, I was at Fresno State. I was there for 8 years, and so I got my first college job and teaching job in 1983. And so I've been here since the early 90s, as I said, and I love it. I came in as the percussionist, which I think you probably know, and then conducting was my midlife crisis. I thought anybody can get a convertible. I would like an orchestra. So that was what I did. And that was, I don't know if I've told any of you, I might have told Ross this story, and Matt, I believe, knows it. First of all, good to see everybody. Hi, Matt. But I was on the executive committee of the music department in the early 2000s. And I was there when Harvey Solberger, who used to be the conductor of the La Jolla Symphony, left that position. And since there was always a faculty member at UCSD who was the conductor of the symphony, Harvey left the position, but he didn't leave the faculty. And so there was not a logical successor for him. And so I came to this meeting as a part of the music faculty. I didn't have any association with the La Jolla Symphony at all. I had been a soloist a couple of times, but I wasn't really that interested in the orchestra and orchestral music. And but I just walked into this meeting, and the La Jolla Symphony board was there, very serious, and we need to find guest conductors because we have this season coming up, and we don't have it budgeted. So do you know anybody who could conduct a concert? We just need, do you know anybody? And in one of those out of body moments, I saw myself raise my hand and say, I'll conduct a concert. And John Fonville, who the flutist, who was the chair of the music department at the time, said, but you don't know how to conduct. And I said in response to him, how hard could it be? And it turns out that, it might have been a little harder than I thought at that moment. But I thought I was going to conduct exactly one concert in my life. So I was just ready to do this one thing. And so I didn't quite know what to program. And so I decided to program a piece of David Lang's. David was a classmate of mine at the University of Iowa, and now he's a Pulitzer Prize winner, and he's gone on to a big career. But I figured that he would forgive me if I screwed his piece up, because we were already friends. And hey, Marcos, how are you doing? Great to see you. Good to see you.
Hi, Steve.
Wonderful to see you. Yeah, great that you're here. David would forgive me, and the Crouching Tiger film had just come out with a score by Tan Dun that had cello solo, string orchestra, and percussion. There were a lot of percussion, so I thought, well, I will know what to do with the percussionists. And then I thought, well, I have a second half to fill. What would you do of those pieces that you used to listen to and love and would have a chance to maybe conduct, and you would fake conduct with recordings and all that sort of stuff? And so I chose the 1911 version of the Firebird. So the first one with 3 harps and 4 winds, etc. I had no business conducting that. What I probably still don't, but certainly not at that point. As it turns out, on my very first concert, Mark Swed from the Los Angeles Times came to review the concert, and I mean, don't ask me why. I just got caught, you know. And so he said the review was not favorable. The review was essentially Steve Schick is a percussionist. He really doesn't have any business conducting. He doesn't have any experience. That showed at every turn. But apparently aversion to risk is not his problem. And I loved that last bit so much that I continue to use that as a press quotation, you know, in my stuff. You know, aversion to risk is not his problem, which I thought, well, then I must be doing something right. I put my hat in the ring for the position, which was then open, and I was chosen, and that was 2007. That's right, 2007 was when I started with the Hawaii Symphony. So I know most of you through, you know, in the capacity of conducting. And that would include Marcos also, you know, because we know each other through my work with ICE. But really, the thing that I actually know how to do is to play percussion. And so, of course, right now in the middle of the pandemic, when conducting is a purely theoretical exercise, you know, I never left percussion, but it has become really, really important to me at this period of time. Now, Victoria, I know you had a bunch of questions and there were things that people wanted to talk about, and I'm happy to continue with anything that you would like to know about me, but I would really love to hear from you guys and hear what you're thinking of and how you're faring in this sad time.
Yeah, so I guess everyone, you can like comment in the chat right now if you have any like thing that you want to add to what we're talking about. So I do actually have a list of questions that I prepared.
I'm not surprised. That's great.
And you kind of already went into my first question, which is what is your music journey like? So you talked about like all the things that you've done for your career, like percussion and conducting and all of that. So how did you actually start your music? So were you always a percussionist growing up, or?
Well, I played piano. I mean, that was my mother. I come from I would say a non-musical family, except that that's not entirely true. My mom was an amateur pianist, and I thought she was great. I have no idea what my current set of judgments would be about her playing, but I'm come from a farm. So my dad was a farmer in Iowa, and I'm the eldest of 5 kids. And my mother, and they came quickly, you know, so there's only 5 years separating the first 4 of us. So a lot of kids on the farm, you know, it was a steady workforce. That was kind of the plan. And I remember really late at night after these, you know, backbreaking days were behind my parents, my mother would play Chopin downstairs. And my memory of that was that my window, which faced the north, would very often kind of creak and moan with the wind because it would just come racing across the prairies. And so for me, Chopin was always associated with weather and with the sound of wind. And even now when I hear the nocturnes, I hear this sort of sense of the night wind across the upper Midwest. And so I had music and sound in my background, but no musical training. And then when I was just beginning to play in fact, it was in the first grade at Wilson Elementary School in Mason City, Iowa, where the band director sent home a list to the kids, to the parents rather, to choose what instrument their child would like to play. And on the top were all the instruments that I actually really wanted to play. Violin was there. I thought that would be great. French horn, for some reason, I thought seemed really exotic in the context of the wasteland of northern Iowa. And at the bottom of that list was not percussion, but drums. And with an annotation that said that the parents did not actually have to buy a drum, just the sticks. And so my mother, who was frugal and looked ahead to, well, what turned out to be 5 children, only 4 at that time, made the financially sound decision that I would play an instrument that didn't require buying an instrument. What she could not have known, and my parents are both gone now, is that in my studio, when I get a chance to see that, there are probably 1,000 instruments. So she thought she was saving me the trouble of buying an instruments, and in fact, she was inscribing me in a life that would be surrounded by them. So yeah, percussion was the first. But you know, the thing about percussion, and I'll make this quick because I want to make sure to talk about the things you care about. But the percussion naturally faces outward in the world because our instruments come from all of these different cultures, and because the practice of playing percussion in the way that I learned it, at least, is, you know, playing pieces for percussion, notated works by composers. Because that's relatively recent, it has the aura, it has the DNA of the 20th century with all of its historical and cultural forces embedded. And so when I play percussion, it automatically makes me face outward towards the cultures from which the instruments came, towards a confederation of playing techniques that are put together, towards composers, many of whom I've known. You know, even the foundational composers for my art were people that I met and knew, Xenakis and Stockhausen and Feldman, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't know any of them very well, Cage, but I met and worked with all of them. And so it felt to me like this was an instrumental discipline wedded to the moment of our time, and that would ask us not to look into what's going on in a practice room, but to see what impact and leverage could our art as percussionists have on the outside world, so that boundary between our music and our lives, which for some people is really strong. You know, there is the musical practice, and then there's the life you lead, and you kind of try to keep them apart, or you feel that they, for some reason, that they should be apart. For percussion, that was never the case, because that boundary was always permeable. It meant that we were taking in influences and in turn trying to act as an agent for some kinds of cultural change on the outside world. So that led me to a lot of different kinds of things, which I frankly considered to be percussion. I was a member of a French circus company for 2 years, in the summers, and this is while I was teaching at UCSD and traveling back and forth. And in one case, I was managing the music. In another case, I was a circus actor playing on amplified pieces of junk in the company. I mean, that's not something that most people would think belonged to a classical musician, but it was a logical extension of percussion to me. Some of you I know that 15 years, no, whatever it was, December of 2006, 14 years ago, I walked from San Diego to San Francisco to propose to my wife, Brenda. She said yes, which was a really good thing. But that walk along 750 miles of California roads near the coast, as much as I could, to listen to the sounds of the environment between here and San Francisco, was also an act of being a percussionist. So I started to think of music, my discipline, but frankly, all of our disciplines, as rather than a task to be mastered, I see it as a system of knowledge and wisdom acquisition. How do we take in the world, metabolize it through sound or some sort of practice, and then re-input our art making, our dialogue with our art into the world, so that there is a sort of circular loop. So if somebody said to me, do you really think that reading this book or doing that thing is really related to percussion? My answer is always yes. Anything that that makes me look out rather than in, is something that really comes from percussion to me, and from music, not just, it's just that's my instrumental discipline.
Okay, that's really cool. And that just sounds so crazy to me, that like you draw all these inspiration from like life, like window sounds and like all of that. That's really cool. So I know that you used to be a pre-med student, actually.
I was.
Correct. So what made you decide to switch like completely to percussion? Because I know also that percussion, like solo percussion at the time, was also like even more rare than it is now. So how did you make that decision, and how did you go from there?
Well, what a very generous and lovely question. Thank you. The simple answer is the C- in biology I got in my freshman year made the decision for me. You know, I figured that if my very first time out in a course that was going to be the principal qualifying credential to get into medical school, I barely got a C. And oh my God, I don't know, have any idea how that could have happened. I sabotaged myself, which is really the absolute answer. I was practicing at that point. Let me back up to say this. I always fantasized about those musical moments because I was a musician. You know, I played in a rock band and, you know, in a wind ensemble, et cetera. And I would have those sort of fantasy moments of, gosh, wouldn't it be great if you could have been at the first performance of The Rite of Spring? Or what if you could have asked Brahms what he thought of his Second Symphony and had a conversation? You know, that's sort of the mythology of the moment of creation. But then when I started playing percussion, I realized that that wasn't mythology for us. The moment of creating these foundational works for my art was happening right then. And so that was an irresistible pull to me. And so the decision made itself because I was practicing 10 hours a day and studying biology about 35 minutes a day. And that showed up in the grades, and that was enough. I did, by the way, once meet my twin. I don't have an actual twin, but I guess we were working on the circus. I was in Paris for rehearsals with the circus, and I was up early in the morning staying in the Marais. Many of you who are familiar with Paris know that that's such a lovely spot, especially in the morning when the cafes are just opening and the bread is being delivered. And I was walking in this kind of idyllic spring day, crossing a street, and facing me opposite was somebody who looked, frankly, exactly like me. I could tell he was American. You know, he had sort of Dockers and scuffy brown shoes and and the Herald Tribune under his arm. But he looked otherwise just like me. And I thought, oh, you know what I'm meeting is me if I had continued to be a doctor. So this was I was meeting my alter ego along that track of because I really wanted to be, and I wanted to deliver babies in a small Iowa town. That would, if you would ask me when I was 18 years old, what I most wanted to do, that would have been the answer. And so probably that's what that guy was doing for a living, something like that.
Okay. Did you actually talk to the person that you saw?
No, we did one of these crazy things because he saw it also. He saw, and we sort of did this little do-si-do and then went on our way.
Oh, wow. So you guys actually didn't talk to each other?
We didn't talk because I thought we might explode. You know, if you know, with antimatter, you never know what will happen. So.
Wow, that's really cool. And that sounds so crazy. So going off of what we're talking about, like percussion ensemble. So I know that you're a part of Bluefish at UCSD. So could you talk about this ensemble a little bit, your inspiration and the ideas behind it?
Yeah. So when I came to San Diego, this is probably too in the weeds for most people, but the standard percussion ensemble size, all the great pieces that existed in the 70s and 80s were written mostly for this group from Strasbourg called the Percussion Strasbourg, and their sextet. And so the early, really, you know, our version of the late Beethoven quartets are percussion sextets, you know, Xenakis, Ingrise, and those composers. So when I came to UCSD, I made a deal with the department that we would have 6 students. As it turns out, we'll have fewer than that next year, but that's mostly, frankly, because of the pandemic. So the idea was that teaching would take place not really in lessons, or not only in lessons, but they would take place in rehearsals. So I would play with a group, and so I would have as much at risk as the students did. And so that was the kind of teaching I was interested in doing. And frankly, for those of us who are all together in the La Jolla Symphony, it's still what I love about it, you know, because when we're working together on a project with a symphony, I have as much at stake as you guys do. And so I feel like that's a kind of teaching that's really interesting, where you're not sort of immunized from risk as a teacher, sitting back and just waiting for your students to perform for you at a certain level, but that you're invested in the same kind of way. So that was part of my initial teaching plan. And then, again, I mentioned David Lang. Early on, David, Michael Gordon, and Julia Wolf invited me to bring Steve Reich drumming to Lincoln Center as a part of the Bang on a Can marathon. This must have been 1995, I think. So it was one of the first years that Bang on a Can was at Alice Tully Hall. It was a short run, 2 or 3 years, that's where the marathon was held. And so we were going to play drumming. And at a certain point, you know, that was great. Everybody was excited. At a certain point, the publicist for Bang on a Can said, okay, well, what's the name of the group? And frankly, the name of the group was Music 201C. While that actually could work in a weird way as the name, they didn't really like that. They wanted me to name the ensemble. And so I kept thinking that I would name it after a piece of literature or a book that was associated with San Diego. And actually, from where I'm sitting here, we live in Bird Rock. It's only about a 3 or 4 minute walk to where Raymond Chandler lived, you know, the great mystery novel. And so momentarily, I thought I'd name the group The Big Sleep, which is one of his famous books, but that didn't seem to be the best name for an ensemble if you wanted people to come. And so I thought, well, the only other kind of real literary luminary is Dr. Seuss around here. So we wanted to name it after Dr. Seuss. We named it Redfish Bluefish. Dr. Seuss at that point was dead, but his wife and the Dr. Seuss Foundation took serious exception. So all the publicity went out. And then we got a cease and desist order from the Seuss Foundation because we weren't supposed to use the name Redfish Bluefish. And then in a sheer stroke of luck, I realized that the actual title of the book is One Fish, Two Fish, and that Redfish Bluefish is just you know, some words from the book. And so we agreed that there wasn't actually a copyright infringement issue, but there was that sort of moment, you're on your way to Lincoln Center. On one hand, there are people here threatening to sue you. On the other hand, there's Steve Reich waiting for you on the stage of Alice Tully Hall. You know, there was trouble everywhere I looked. And so we named it Redfish Bluefish, played drumming, Steve liked it, and that was the beginning of that.
So what kind of music do you guys play now? Like, do people compose for the ensemble, or do you guys play from like existing work?
And this is something that Marcos and I will talk about at some point. I'm sure that it's a training ensemble for graduate percussionists and some undergraduates. Matt Levesque played this year with us. And so by and large, we recycle kind of formative pieces for their pedagogical value. So we play the Xenakis pieces and the Grisette pieces and Cajun, etc. And we also commission pieces from the graduate student complement of composers. And very often, there's not a piece on every performance, but most concerts will have a student work on it. So it's a laboratory. It's a way of studying and teaching, but it's also a laboratory for making the music. And from that standpoint, we've been able, frankly, to do, you know, in very small steps, because we're just one group, to do something about the unbelievable gender and diversity problems that high modernist music has. Because, you know, if I list those names for you, they're all men, they're all white, they're all dead. And so by commissioning younger composers, this is a way in which we can redress those problems little by little. By you imagine a world the way you would want it to be, and then you start to fill in the details through your art. And that's kind of I mean, very much like what you're doing here, getting people together, conversing, examining options. I mean, this is why I was so delighted to accept your invitation.
Thank you. When you conduct the ensemble, or like in general in La Jolla Symphony and in your other creative work, who are some of your musical inspirations, or like what are some of your musical inspirations?
You asked me about musical inspirations, right? It froze slightly. So look, I'm an omnivert. So, you know, some people are introverts and some people are extroverts. I'm an omnivert. I both look inside and look out. And so that means that I really love a lot of different kinds of music. And I don't feel that stylistic distinctions are the most important distinctions that you can make. So I love the music that we do in the La Jolla Symphony, and you know, it's a mixture of sort of time-honored classics and a lot of new music, as you all, I look around the screen, you know that you've struggled through them with all of us, and so that's really important to me. Those are inspirations. So the composer working in collaboration with the performer is a huge source of inspiration. But I love classical music also. I really do. I listen to it. I think about it. But I listen to jazz. I played pop music. I played a lot well, mostly sort of rhythm and blues and regional touring bands when I was growing up. I love that. I love country music. And in a way, it feels weird even to start listing styles as opposed to thinking that music is the natural language that people have. So I am interested in persons. I don't know if I'm interested in people as the sort of large group, but I'm interested in individual people and collections of people that make art. And so whatever it is that they make as their art, I'm naturally pretty interested in it.
I see.
That was probably
So,
a pretty bad answer, but I hope it was okay.
so would you say that you have a favorite composer at all, or it's just like a
You know, it's a little
cluster?
bit like asking which is your favorite kidney, you know. It changes all the time. So
What's
I
the
mean,
current favorite? Oh, sorry.
that's a really good one. You know, I'm not thinking very much about conducting now.
Mhm.
Can I answer this in this way?
Mhm.
This moment, and I know you sent me a note about talking about the result of the pandemic. This moment is filled with longing, I think, for a lot of us. I mean, whenever we start talking about our current situation, I think it's really important to underscore that there is actual real pain in the world, that there are people who are sick and who are suffering and who are heartbroken and who are alone. And so I always want to make sure that I say that before we start talking about what's the impact on, you know, like, how am I doing here, all of that. So I think any comment about the pandemic has to be framed by the fact that we here, if we're all healthy and able to see our loved ones, maybe even live with them, that we are the lucky ones. But nevertheless, if we get beyond, if you look beyond that, I think this moment for all of us is one that is filled with longing. Like I long for, you know, stupid and, so I'm afraid to say, sort of embarrassingly venal things, like giving a concert in a big city and then going out to dinner afterwards. You know, the last time I think one of the last times Marcos and I saw each other was, you know, at Le Monde after a Miller Theater concert, and down at, you know, having a martini and ordering something to eat and going around and hugging everybody. You know, I long for that. I can feel what it's like to have someone walk by me and put their hand on my shoulder just to get by. I don't know when the next time that will happen. And it's like something I never thought about, but I miss that. I miss like simple rituals like shaking hands with a concertmaster. I long for the fact that many of you are part of this. Some of you don't know that we canceled the La Jolla Symphony concert 5 minutes before one of the last dress rehearsals for the Britain War Requiem. We had 300 people there, and we have to go. Got to, you know, everybody leave right away. You know, like I long for being on stage with people all doing the same thing, and all of these kinds of things. And I think it's important to acknowledge that at this point, because otherwise the difference between us flourishing at this moment and withering is whether or not we can take the natural longing that is a part of this moment and direct it for something salutary, something healthy, something nourishing. And, you know, that is naturally going to be on a much smaller scale than we were used to doing it. Instead of conducting the Britain War Requiem, and then I was leaving the next day to conduct Messiaen Canyons and Stars in San Francisco, and then off on a 3-month Asian tour, etc. None of that happened. So all of the force behind that now has got to be, I smile at my neighbors. They don't know it because I've got a mask on, but they can, you can tell when somebody's smiling at you with a mask on. Or we cook together, or we read, or there's just quiet time. And so how we deal with that kind of backlog of emotion that comes from simply stopping where we are, it will be a critical aspect to how we get through all of this. So I know that I'm very, very far afield from your original very good question.
Oh,
But
that's
it
okay.
feels to me that this is really something that we're all thinking about, is what is the nature of a musical practice when performance is no longer a part of it? And I know people are doing online things. Everybody's doing that. I'm a little less interested in that than many of my friends and colleagues for reasons we can talk about. But still, no matter how satisfying a given moment might be, it's not the same thing as playing Britain together and me standing off on the side of where the violins and the percussionists come off and shaking everybody's hands and thanking them. Nothing we can do online can replace that. So how do we manage in the meantime? What is music like in the absence of being able to perform it?
I see. So do you think that this has changed your perspective on how to do music during the quarantine or even after quarantine?
Yeah, well, I'm sure that it will. In fact, let us hope that it does, because an experience this strong should change our lives. You know, I remember thinking this when my dad died. If this doesn't change my life, then I've wasted the pain that I just went through. I have to be different after I come through that experience, or all this will have been for nothing. And so I suspect that one thing I guess for me, one of the things that will change is the question of what is the scale of, what is an appropriate scale of activity? Should there be a greater amount of modesty in our musical practice? And I say that as someone who has traveled all over the world and felt very, very fortunate for it. And now I look at you, it's your turn to do all of that kind of stuff. But I just wonder if people really need to see me on stages all the time. I wonder whether or not there's another way to make a contribution without stopping playing or anything like that. But is there a scalable aspect so that we can retreat to something that is more sustainable? I mean, you realize that the pandemic cannot be separated from the other problems we've got. The pandemic is a version of climate change, right? It is also a version of the way we treat one another. It is the version of the care we have and the community we build in the society. So all of these things are part of a much larger picture. So I hope that for all of us, but I'll speak only for myself, that issues of modesty and sustainability and scalability in my artistic practice will persist long after this is gone. And of course, we don't know when that will be. So I'm so curious to hear from other people about your experiences. I'm happy to talk, but that feels like a waste of an opportunity for those of you who are there and working on your own. I'd be curious to hear what you're doing.
Would you like to open up the discussion?
Oh, absolutely. I long for it. Otherwise, I'll just have to hear the stories of myself that I already know. So tell me, Allison, you're right next to me on the screen here as I look over there. So tell me, hello, neighbor. And can you tell me how are you managing and what is are you practicing still, or does it feel weird considering there's not a concert to practice for? Or how are you managing your day-to-day music making?
Yeah, it's definitely very strange. I mean, I've been doing orchestral stuff since I was in 4th grade, so to have this huge period of time where I'm not, aiming to practice for, a certain performance or a certain concert with a whole bunch of other people is just so different,
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I'm definitely still playing and working on solos and stuff. So it's been quite nice actually to do that and focus on my own playing, and hopefully, in the future, I'll be able to use those skills that I've improved on for future collaborations and different orchestras or something, so.
Do you find that your practice, and this I'd be happy to hear from anybody, do you find that your practice has changed at all? Like the average practice session, does it feel the same as it did before, only minus the concert? Or is this period of time also changing the quality, the texture of the work?
For me, I think it's definitely changed it. I don't really have time restrictions now, which is interesting to think about. So time is kind of just passing as I'm working over things, and 1 hour turns to like 2 hours and turns to 3 hours, and by then I've worked on one line in the span of 3 hours. So it's interesting to think about now, as in in the past I had to practice more efficiently. I had to take into consideration my commuting times to and from school, to and from campus, and all the different orchestras I'm in, you know, practicing
Yeah.
for chamber as well as La Jolla.
Yeah,
So
of course. Well,
that
I'm so
definitely
happy to
changed.
hear you say that, because this is what's happening to me also. You know, after a long time of really of getting a sort of expertise, part of the expertise of being a performer playing concerts on tour is to say, how many concerts do you have? What are the programs? How far are they away? So you never go into a practice room, or I haven't for decades, without saying, without having a little voice. Okay, this piece has to be done in 2 weeks. Where are you? And so then there's this constant sense that the clock is running, and you stop practicing when you have judged that you're far enough along to be on track, right? And so it doesn't mean that the problems have been explored. It doesn't mean that you're finished thinking about it. It means that you're okay relative to when this piece has to be on its feet on a stage. And so I find that I'm working on little pieces, because, you know, here you're in my garage right now. So I played Global Cartouche, which is a little table of instruments. I did that on the Bang and a Can Festival a couple of weeks ago, and working on Fernie Howe Bone Alphabet, which is a small setup, and it's a very difficult piece. And I found that 2 hours went by and I had worked on 5 bars. And I would never have let myself do that. I couldn't have afforded to do that, because this sort of sense of being pushed towards a goal was so strong in the practice. So I'm frankly discovering things about the pieces and myself and what I can do and what I care about that I never did, because I didn't have enough. My practice life was not aerated well enough. It was densified. The goal was, how much can we get in here so that on Tuesday morning after the La Jolla rehearsal, I can get on a plane and fly someplace and play a concert and be back by the next week. You know, that was really for a long time the way of doing so. I wonder about anybody else. Gabrielle, do you have the same experience? Or can you talk about your practice and how music seems to you now?
Well, Matt has very graciously modified chamber orchestra, actually. I'm not sure if you know, maybe he's
I
talking about
do.
it. Yes, and so he's having us play through solo works and giving us structure during this time. And so I actually feel like, besides the lack of time restriction, that my practice hasn't really shifted in terms of quality, I guess, but quantity has definitely improved, which I'm very thankful for, because there are some moments when I am practicing and I'm just grateful to be able to practice my art when I know that during the quarantine there are maybe percussionists out there or dancers who do not have the full scope of their capabilities accessible to them, because facilities everywhere are closed. And so I definitely feel an air of gratefulness when I'm
Well,
able to
that's wonderful to
practice.
hear. That's really, and Matt, I know about your plans. I think that's just absolutely fantastic that you're doing that. And yeah, I'm on a lot of these kinds of calls with percussionists basically all over the world. And so that's a very different kind of call when you're dealing with people who, you know, there's a lot of ingenious things coming out of this moment. People who are unable to do the art that they want, then they find these really amazing ways around it. The percussionists are doing that. I know, I'm sure you are as well. And then I gave a bunch of lectures to the San Francisco Conservatory this month, in essence, because we canceled the Messiaen project. Now, with respect to them, and they are wonderful people, and I like the institution. The institution's very impressive, frankly. But I'm talking to a bunch of people when I'm talking to them who are in hardcore training to get big-time orchestra jobs. That's mostly the people I'm talking to. And so the anxiety in those calls is palpable, because not only do you have the normal problems in getting one of those jobs, because, you know, you open a job in the Oregon Symphony or something like that, and you have 400 applicants for your position. So that's already hard enough. The fact that we don't know what will happen to the institution of the symphony orchestra over the short to midterm just made those calls full of kind of crackle with anxiety. But then I discovered, because I did weekly lectures over about 5 weeks, that by the time we were finished with it, some people, not everybody, you could feel that there was a certain amount of weight that was falling away from them. like the expectations, because that whole course of study to be in an orchestra is about meeting other people's expectations for how you need to play this excerpt or that excerpt, and you have to be perfect, etc. And not perfect according to your calculations, perfect to a search committee behind a screen. This little glimpse that you can make music and pursue a life as a musician without having that, you know, shouting over your shoulder, I think was freeing to a lot of people. And the sort of sense that the weight of expectation and that the weight of tradition was falling away, I think I could feel that there. And so, yeah, anyway, that's related less to you guys, because I think you're already in a more interesting musical spot than many of those people were. Colleen,
Yeah,
what
so
about you? Oh, please, Isaac, go ahead. Yeah.
yeah, I was gonna say, if you don't mind, I'd like to add on to your discussion. I mean, I think so. First of all, thank you. There's a lot of excellent points. I wish I could address a lot of the things you talked about previously, but staying on the topic we're on right now. So because I play bass, but of course my bass has been locked away in CPMC for the past several months.
Yeah.
But so, you know, in some ways, like I can't practice like in the way that I've practiced in the past. Well, I just can't practice, period. But at the same time, so like and over the past, like, I don't know, like 10 years, like off and on, I like to write music and create music. But it's usually kind of like ad hoc. And then, but I feel like now, because when I would practice before, it's always goal driven. So because if I don't have a goal, I'm the kind of person who I'll just completely go off track. Like I will be playing, and then like 5 minutes later I'll just be making something up, because like I'll lose focus on what's on the page if I don't have that goal. But in terms of like being able to write new music, it's been a really good time period for that aspect, where you don't have to be worried about anything, and where like I'm unable to do practice like I normally practice. So
yeah, but you know, it's interesting to hear you say that, because of course I believe me, I understand totally what you're saying. When you're distracted, you need to be on task, and you think of that as a waste of time. But then, you know, like, read Thoreau and think about his thoughts about walking, for example, and what it meant to walk was precisely not the moment of your disciplined practice. What he was embracing and advocating was the moment of wandering. And so I wonder if there is, again, something to be gained at this moment, because the wandering, I'm sorry you don't have your bass, that's a bummer, but you're wandering and you're exploring in other areas, which I think is really great. One thing I'll just throw in, just, you know, apropos the biographical detail, for the last, I think 20 years or so, it's not on a regular basis, but every 3 to 5 years, we'll say, I take 4 months off, or a considerable period off, and don't practice and don't do anything to do with music. And for me, this is an extremely important thing. It proves to me that I am not handcuffed to my instrument, that I can have a life without it, that I can have a life without being a musician, that I can, you know, can do other kinds of things. And it also, again, provides this moment of reunion with the art that is so sweet, and then you remember what it is that you loved about it in the first place. And the first time I did that was to study French. I went to live in Paris and studied French, wrote the percussion book that I wrote in there. So I guess I was dealing with music to some extent, but I was making a point of not seeing my musician friends. I didn't go to concerts and everything. I was basically taking French classes. And I remember this moment. This is a totally meaningless story, so just get ready to ignore it. But I was in one of those French culture classes, and the teacher was going on, and then finally came around to music, like what is contemporary music in Paris, and said something about Xenakis that frankly wasn't true. And so I you know, again, nobody knew I was a musician. I was just this middle-aged American guy in French classes. And so I objected to the teacher on the basis of her observations about Xenakis, and you can imagine how haughty the advanced culture and conversation teacher of the Alliance Française in Paris could be when you disagreed with her. And she looked down her glasses at me like this, and she said, "Ah, Mr. Schick, so you know the music of Xenakis, do you?" And I said, "No, I know Xenakis." And I went and I launched into this like 15 minutes, like about my experiences with it, and all in French. And it felt like the greatest drug you had ever taken, coming like after 2 months. I guess I was 2 months without hearing music or doing it or really talking about it. And all of a sudden I had this opening, and man, did I ever step through that. And so I thought, oh, right, I'm doing the right thing with my life, and B, I'm ready to go back. I'm ready to go back and do this thing. And so I've done that. Well, I guess I'm doing it now, right? To some extent. I'm not playing concerts, but I studied a few times, Italian twice, French once, and then the other one was walking up the coast. So these periods where you decide to be away from your art so that you can back up from it a little bit, see it with some kind of perspective. And then at first I was worried, well, what happens if I don't want to go back? Like what happens if, yeah, it felt pretty good not practicing every day. And then I think, well, you have to leave that open, right? It's not a prison sentence. It's a decision that we make. And if you would decide afterwards that you actually don't really want to be a musician, then that's also a sign of success. Then go do the thing you want to do. And for me, it's always been an unbelievable joy to go back. But I think the student, this is a little bit of a non sequitur, not really though. The student I feel was almost one of my proudest accomplishments is somebody that I don't think anybody here knows, Matt Jenkins. He's an extraordinary percussionist. In the middle of his doctoral work, he decided not to be a percussionist and is now a backcountry ranger in the Grand Canyon National Park. So instead of thinking of that, oh, I somehow failed Matt, no, I think along my lines of that percussion is a way of knowledge acquisition, wisdom acquisition. I think actually his was a huge success story because he found his way through a musical practice to the thing he wanted to do. And I think that's what we all could hope for, I think. Who else is, Colleen, I was just about to ask you how you were doing, and then I got sidetracked in my long and fairly, frankly, pointless story. But can I ask you now? Tell me how you're doing and what are you doing and how are you pursuing your art?
I'm doing okay. So for the moment, I've moved back in with my parents. I'm at home.
Is home here in San Diego or is
no? I'm in Maryland. So
oh, you're in Maryland. Okay, great. Yeah, fantastic.
So I haven't been practicing as much because I think it's interesting that you were talking earlier about percussion being this outward facing mindset, sort of. Mm-hmm. Because I think with the quarantine, it's been much easier for me to go like back inward and like look back in my past and, oh, I want to play a piece, I'll play something I've already played. And it's like much harder to say like, oh, I'm going to work on something new or do new things. And Isaac, it's interesting that you said that it's been easier to write music because I think it's been harder for me a little bit with like not being able to go outside and do things. And I have talked to a couple of friends who also create art of other sorts. And they've also said, it's hard when there's not really anything to get inspiration from because we're inside, not doing anything. So I just think that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is one of these moments when there's not a wrong way to do our lives, right? The oldest person that you have ever met has never been through this. So, I mean, somebody who was old enough to remember the 1918, pandemic is probably no longer alive, or at least I don't know anybody like that. So, we look to each other. So the function of being an elder, so to speak, is problematized in this particular case because the goal of an elder, when I have my elders that I check in on, and I probably act in that capacity to other people. But the whole way you do it is, oh, this happened to me, or some version of this happened to me, and here's how I did it. But there's nobody to talk to about this moment. And so, you know, and I know you didn't say this, but I'm glad to hear that you didn't, that you somehow are second guessing whether you should or should not do new work. I think that we should feel that this moment can be solved in myriad individual ways, and that we're basically doing our best here. So I'm happy to hear that you're looking back at old things. I'm reading Proust again. I read the Remembrance of Times Past in my first summer here when I came, just exactly in Marco's position, right? So I had not yet taken the job, but I had moved to San Diego, although I don't see San Diego behind you there, Marcos. And I came here and I went and took this big Proust book, it's 7 volumes, 3,000 pages, to Windansea Beach. And every day I would read these really long sentences, and every day these really long waves would come in, and I would eventually fall asleep, and then I'd wake up and read. So all I did for like 3 months. And that book is all about the functionality of memory. So Colleen, when you talk about the way you're dealing with music that you knew in the past, I totally get it. I was drawn to think about those issues again. That's why I'm looking at the book again. But I spent also quite a lot of time trying to understand how time is passing, and how I'm to metabolize the past that I know in service of the present that I don't know. I don't know if that's very well said, but that's how I think. And so I think that I understand completely your strategizing along and why that appeals to you.
Yeah, I do miss playing new music, though. It's not so much that I don't want to play new music. It's more like, you know, it's I'm not in an ensemble now. No one is making me learn new pieces, which I do miss, but I'm just not doing as much now.
Right. Well, I hope before too long we'll all be back learning new pieces together. We had this, I thought, amazing season plan, La Jolla Symphony. It's one of the ones I was the proudest of, and now it's all been chopped up, and we're gonna, some of you were on these calls, but we'll start after the first of the year. Probably it won't be really large ensembles, I don't think, in the fall. It doesn't look like it. We'll have some small ensembles and some things. Who knows what's going to happen, frankly. But we're essentially planning to start after the first of the year. And so that feels like a long time before we can all be together. I love those first rehearsals, where it's kind of a little bit before you realize that you have to keep working in order to get to the goal, and you're just having this experience with a piece. Those are, I think, exhilarating and breathtaking. And for those of you in the orchestra, whenever we start playing the first piece we'll do, whenever we're able to put the chorus and the orchestra together on stage, then the plan is to do the Mahler Resurrection. And that first rehearsal of Mahler 2 will be, I think that I can taste it. I can taste what that will feel like. Who else? I know there are a number of people that I'd just be curious, or Victoria, why don't I hand this back to you, and you can direct us in whatever way you would like.
So we're actually down to our last 10 minutes, so I was going to open this up to any questions from anyone. So anyone is free to jump in right now. Or if you want to type it in the chat and I can read it.
Yes, this is one of the questions that we had planned about, just talking about music in the state of quarantine right now. And this is more on a lighter note, but what have been your favorite moments of music and art during the pandemic that sort of proves its essentiality in society? Like, what have you seen in the world of art at home or abroad that was just heartwarming and inspiring, such as people singing from their balconies and while self-isolating in Italy, or how all the major orchestras of the world have opened their performances for free streaming just to allow people to have music in their homes during this time?
Well, that is a fantastic question, isn't it? And it is the thing that makes us so happy. That in New York, of course, the playing of pots and pans at whatever, is it 7 o'clock? Is that yeah, great. I mean, that's always what cultures have done to make themselves known, right? So that the pots and pans that you found in the protests in Chile against Pinochet, and you found it in Argentina, you find it all over the world. People grab what they have and they just make noise. So I was really happy to hear that. You know, there was some honking and things like that. On a personal level, music is really important, you know, individually. And I've set up schedules for myself during the day so that the day just doesn't blend together. So the practice that I do is always in the morning, and I put the Zoom meetings and the teachings in the afternoon, because that afterwards you just feel like somebody's hit you in the face. You know, it's so exhausting. And then Brenda and I, we dress for dinner and we have a cocktail. So we get dressed and we have, it's very much like Gilligan's Island, you know, sort of like, you know, just, and so that ritual, which is every day, and music is always a part of that. So I know this is a very personal answer rather than a societal answer, but our favorite, you know, I've had a turntable forever, and it's a pretty good system, and so we take a jazz LP out, put it on, you know, hear that beautiful sound of the hiss that the stylus gives, and have a cocktail and talk about our days. It feels very, you know, sort of like, yeah, sort of civilized in the context of like one of the few things we can control. So there's that. So music feels really important. It doesn't work without music. You know, where I live in Bird Rock, we don't have those nightly displays of kinds of things, and people are not singing opera. But there's this sort of sound of the surf. I would consider this a musical sound. I have, at the risk of too much information, I will say that I have a meditation practice where I sit outdoors every night just before I go to bed for 20 minutes or something like that. And there's a sitting meditation part of it, but then I spend 10 minutes or so just hearing what I can hear. And from my house, I can hear the waves crash on the shore near Bird Rock. And last night it was windy, so all of the palm trees are making those fantastic sounds. So most people don't think of that as music per se, but I'll come back to my original point about the ear that I have as a percussionist, and many of you do in your own ways, so that the sounds of the world that we're listening to are an important part of a musical celebration of the end of each day for me.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Of course.
That's actually funny. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
No,
but so because I've been staying with my parents, and they live out like basically in the middle of nowhere, in the desert. It's actually like desert mountains, like Joshua trees everywhere, and so you would think, wow. It's like there's no people around, and you'd think it'd be quiet, but you know, every night, so like my sister and I go for walks, and it's just a cacophony of so much noise of all the birds and the wind and the trees, and things like rattlesnakes occasionally.
Yeah.
And it's just like without people, there is so much that exists that we don't hear in our normal lives.
Yeah, you know, there's a sort of version of this, right, in food, where it's possible to so dull your senses by eating junk that when you have, say, a tomato or a peach, it doesn't taste like anything because you don't have any frame of reference anymore. So the same thing is true with sound. You know, we are sometimes so eager to saturate our lives, and I've been a part of systems that were totally saturated, so I point the finger at me. But then when they're gone, and Isaac, I think I completely get it. You know, like the birds seem so off the hook now because, you know, I'm able to sit and listen to them, and I do. And we've built, and it's just around in the backyard, planted these little milkweed plants because the monarch caterpillars love them. And so now in this nearby tree, we've got all of these chrysalises with developing monarchs in them, and you can see the shape of the wing, you know, through that. I'm there every day, seeing which butterflies have hatched and where the birds are, and so I think that there's this is a part of our musical world too, I think so. Great. Are there other questions? I'm happy to stay as long as you want. I know other people have things to do, and but so Victoria, I'll pass this back to you so you can shepherd us.
We don't want to invade too much of your time today. So
Well, I'm happy to talk to you. So if there's another question, I'm happy to
okay.
answer or hear from you.
I actually have a question that's pretty much like unrelated from music, but to me, you just have such amazing creativity, and I just wanted to ask, like, what's the craziest thing that you've done, like whether musically or just anything in life in general?
Well, first of all, it's a very nice preamble, very generous. Yeah, I may not tell you the craziest things I've done, but I could give you. I think the one of the most interesting. Here is an answer. Right when I was out of school, there was this arts presenting institution in New York called Affiliate Artists. I don't think it exists anymore. I don't think so. Anyway, I didn't have any prospects. I didn't have a job, and I auditioned for them. And their goal was to put classical musicians into non-conventional performance spaces. This was at a time when that was kind of a brand new idea. So I played this unbelievably high modernist repertory that I've been talking about, right? But yet fruit packing plants in Washington State, or mental institutions, or libraries, and I played Stockhausen 125 times in central Washington State, for example, in all of these different kinds of places. And so I think one of the craziest things I ever did was to give a concert at a construction site in North Carolina after a house was built, arriving somehow 3 hours after the construction was done and the keg had been opened, and all the construction, I mean, why this was a good idea, I have no idea. All the construction workers had been drinking beer all afternoon, and I show up with this unbelievable arch modern music to play a concert for them. And I played Stockhausen, I played Cyclus for them, and I realized that they were really gonna kill me. This was not gonna go well. And I said that we were going to abandon the program as printed, and I just handed out the instruments to everybody and grabbed a cup of beer, and we jammed for an hour and a half. And that both saved my life and was a fantastic musical experience. I'll give you that as an answer. There are plenty of other ones. I think starting one day where I walked out of the house, went to the ocean, and turned right and didn't stop until I got to San Francisco. That was also a crazy moment.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I feel like to me, I feel like I would never have done that myself, and I feel like it's harder to go even crazier than that.
Yeah.
But wow. So I actually have another question.
Please do.
So I know that a lot of your music, the music that you do, and correct me if I'm wrong, is like contemporary music or like new music, experimental music. And so as we move forward in time, how do you think that the new music, which will always be, like the music of that time, how do you think that's going to change as we move forward?
Well, that is a fantastic question, because I was just thinking about this morning. So your question is, I'll give you the answer that I already formulated a couple of hours ago. When anybody would ask me what I do, I would say that I was a contemporary percussionist. Mostly that was a sort of tribal affiliation. In other words, that meant that I aligned myself with people who were doing experimental music and playing new percussion music. But nobody once ever said contemporary to what? And that's a question about contemporary music. With what are we contemporaries? And so it's an incredibly important question now because of the pandemic. Pardon me, but it's always been an important question. So, I used to think that I was a contemporary percussionist because I have vague and long-lasting claustrophobia, and playing contemporary music always meant that there weren't crowds around. You never had to worry about a lot of people coming to your concert. So I felt, oh, that's great. It's a solution to claustrophobia. But now it feels to me that what contemporary means is being a meaningful interface between the time you live and the art you make. And that everything has to be judged by that. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't play Beethoven, of course, but I think we can play Beethoven as though Beethoven were a contemporary composer, as though Beethoven had something to say to us in this moment. And frankly, I think if we can't find that connection between the classics and our life now, then we shouldn't play it. But it's there if you want to dig for it. So being somebody involved in contemporary music will necessarily be tied to whatever contemporary means, and that will change. And so in one way I can answer the question that way. In another way, I would say to you, well, I have no idea what contemporary will mean in a year or a month, or frankly, later this week. So it's very open about what being a contemporary musician will be.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so does anyone else have questions? So I, like you saw my list of questions, so
Yeah.
I have way more, but does anyone else have questions?
I have a question.
Please.
Is this why you like to include Beethoven in a lot of what you do? Because I know you used to teach the class on Beethoven and the Beatles, and then
Yep.
you also, included Beethoven in your interpolations concert.
Yep.
Is that something you would plan on also putting on in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question, Allison. Beethoven is a meaningful composer to me, and partially because I find that the time he lived and the time we live are remarkably similar. There's a similar kind of grappling with technology. I mean, for us, it's Zoom. For Beethoven, it was the piano. It was a time of political upheaval in which the principles of democracy were being debated. Clearly, that's where we are as well. So it feels like there's a lot of resonance. And so you're completely right. I have put Beethoven on a lot of concerts, but for me, the goal is then to combine Beethoven with something that that catalyzes that music for us today. Like, I don't want to cast aspersions on a local institution, but when the San Diego Symphony played a concert that was the Egmont Overture, Beethoven 4 and Beethoven 5, I thought, what is that all about? I mean, not that those are not great pieces, but what are you seeking to do? How are you seeking to understand Beethoven, except as a way to say that people will buy tickets to that? So I love all of those pieces. I love the fourth. I mean, the Fourth Symphony is extraordinary, and people don't play it very often, but I love the Fourth Symphony. And I loved that project with the First Symphony, the interpolations that you were referring to, where we wove, Matt played on that concert, wove pieces in there. And I programmed the William Grant Still Afro-American Symphony just before the Beethoven Ninth. And so I love that kind of thing. But an abdication of Beethoven in the present tense feels like a missed opportunity, and B, a total misunderstanding of Beethoven. Beethoven was a revolutionary, and so he would be the one shaking his fist at the well-heeled people at those receptions, not the one whose music was being played in the corner to entertain them. So I feel like that, but I think Bach is almost more interesting right now. Have you seen this really wonderful presentation of the St. John's Passion? You can find it on YouTube, for trio, for solo singer who sings all the parts, one percussionist and one keyboard player, so harpsichord and organ. And it's done in Leipzig at the Bach Church near the grave. And then some of the choral parts are done pre-recorded on Zoom, so it looks exactly like this does. But it's amazing, because Bach was actually a composer whose music was intended for constant manipulation and constant updating, right? You couldn't do that with Beethoven. Beethoven finalized his pieces in the way Bach never did. So I think early music right now is, and of course Bach is not early music to early music specialists, but pre-classical music, could we say, feels like it has a lot of relevance to me right now, in the same way that, for example, post-World War II music does as well, or maybe even 21st century music. It feels like there's a real kinship there.
I see. That's very, very interesting to hear about. So thank you so much, and for putting on all these amazing concerts to make us think.
Thank you. Well, I want to give you guys a compliment, if I could. I mean, I think what you're doing here with this, and I know it's a group effort that people are combining, this kind of you know, community building and reaching out for other points of view, coming together, the quality of the questions that you asked, both, you know, in person and the questions that I received beforehand. It's just so, it makes me feel so good. I've always said that coming to UCSD was the second best decision I ever made in my life. And when I see this and I see you and I have this conversation, it just makes me know that I was right about that. So thank you to everybody that invited me and for your fantastic participation. And you know how to reach me, you know, so if you have something that comes up or if there's ever anything I can do to help you, then I hope you will not hesitate.
Thank you so much. That means so much to us.
Good. And yeah, and so let's talk again. I enjoy hearing from individuals, and in the meantime, I'll be thinking about you and wishing you the best of health and spirits.
Thank you.
Okay, everybody, enjoy your weekend.